Welcome to Sons of Patriarchy. Before we dive into today's episode, we want to take a moment to provide a content warning. In this episode, we'll be discussing sensitive topics including emotional, spiritual, and sexual abuse. We understand that these subjects can be triggering for many listeners. If you find yourself feeling uncomfortable or need to take a break, please feel free to pause or skip to a later segment. Your well-being is our top priority. We encourage you to reach out for support if you need it. There are resources available to help you through difficult times, and those can be found in our show notes and intake forms to private support communities, which are screened. In today's episode, we'd like to extend a special shout out to Advocacy from the Presbyterian Pew, dedicated to helping lay people in the PCA to understand PCA church government and process, and to follow PCA business, especially related to caring for victims of abuse. A link to their group is in our show notes. One more shout out for Mountain City Christian Counseling, founded by Megan Owen, pastoral counselor, has been helping women heal from abusive marriages, systems, and churches for 4 years now. After running a nonprofit for single mothers leaving abuse for 7 years, Megan decided it was time to open her own practice and reach a wider audience with her modalities of EMDR and spiritual processing groups. A link to Mountain City will be in our show notes, as well as an upcoming retreat Megan is hosting in July for those navigating these issues. Thank you for being here with us today. Welcome to Opinionated, Abuse in the PCA, Part 2. In this episode, I will speak with Colleen McConnell, a former member of St. Paul's Presbyterian Church, PCA, in Orlando, Florida, and Megan Owen, who was counseled by the late Jim Wilson, Doug Wilson's father. I get it if you don't like me. I get it if you don't like how we do things at Sons of Patriarchy. But here's the thing. Doing it the approved way just doesn't work. Working through presbyteries, and in Colleen's case, winning, still doesn't do anything. It's you, usually a woman, against the good old boys club, when pastoral calls are more important than shepherding the flock of Jesus. When making sure that ministers' good names are secured at the expense of the spiritual and emotional lives of those they're supposedly ministering to. When exposing these men is met with a stronger defense than the cases they should be bringing against accused abusers. Let's say a woman wins her case. What now? How do you think she's viewed by her church, her elders, her presbytery? She exposed abuse. She exposed sin. She has supposedly attempted to tarnish their collective reputations. This is exactly what happened to Colleen McConnell in the PCA, who I spoke to first. Let's begin.
Yeah, so my name is Colleen McConnell. I was a member of the PCA from, I want to say, 2015 until 2019, so 4 years, kind of a short amount of time. And I actually came to the PCA from the OPC. So I was raised in kind of I would call it like a post-fundamentalist Baptist upbringing, very heavily influenced by John MacArthur. And so that's how I was raised when I got married to my now ex-husband. He was coming out of the Anglican Church in Egypt, and he had moved to more of a Presbyterian understanding of things. And so when we got married, we ended up joining an OPC church in St. Paul, Minnesota, is where we initially joined the OPC. So that would have been 2011, maybe 2012 in there. Probably 2011-ish. So I made kind of a big jump going from raised in kind of this MacArthur Baptist, John Piper Baptist idea of how church works and the sacraments and everything to the OPC, kind of dive right into that side. So I started off in a very conservative OPC. I actually enjoyed my time at the OPC church in St. Paul. Yeah, I enjoyed that church. Part of it was, I'm sure I had no need to avail myself of the session at the time. And so I enjoyed that type of worship, kind of the very, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of that very outlined type of worship that the
Yeah,
OPC
regular
is now.
principle of worship are very
Yeah, yeah,
liturgically oriented.
yeah, liturgically oriented. I think that's what really I enjoyed about it initially, the most. So, my ex-husband and I were married in 2010. We went to the OPC Church in St. Paul. We ended up moving out to Pennsylvania in 2013. I want to say it was 2013. And because my husband was attending Westminster to get his doctorate, he was doing a PhD. So we had moved out to Philly, the suburbs of Philly, and started attending the OPC church that's directly across from Westminster. Like you can walk across the very
Calvary
narrow.
OPC, I think. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, yeah. I had it written down, but it wasn't on the tip of my tongue. So, yeah, we started attending there. And it was much like a continuation of the church in St. Paul, but it was much, much larger. That was the unusual thing, because the church that I attended in St. Paul, it wasn't by any means tiny, but going to the OPC church directly across from Westminster and all of the students and all the professors that were there, it was much larger, big, kind of a bigger sea change. So I had gotten married to my now ex-husband in 2010. We're in Pennsylvania in 2013. Yeah, that's kind of where the larger story starts, is really in Pennsylvania.
Gotcha. So what was your move from the OPC into the PCA? And then what was that culture shift like, that culture vibe like from the OPC to the PCA? Before we get into the meat of the story, what was it like attending there before you started getting into the session and stuff?
Yeah, so in 2015, my then husband and I moved from Philly down to Florida for a number of reasons. And when we arrived in Florida, we went to the OPC church that met on RTS's campus, and they were fine. I don't think I particularly cared for it, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but we ended up more at my then husband's prompting. We ended up going to a larger PCA church. So the PCA church is called St. Paul's in Orlando. It's one of the larger PCA churches in Central Florida. And it also has kind of an interesting distinction of also being very, very liturgical, kneeling for prayers and confession of sin. And, we would, I think the kneeling thing was kind of the most novel part of it. I don't remember doing that in the OPC. It was at St. Paul's that we did that. So we went from the OPC to the PCA, but we went to kind of this very traditionally liturgical church. So it felt like a change, but also not like a huge sea change. One of the biggest changes is there was not an expectation that you attend 2 church services every day. Like in the OPC, a lot of them have a morning and an evening service, and you're expected to be at an evening service, which was kind of difficult when I had like a 4-year-old son who needed to go to bed. When we moved to the PCA, it was Sunday morning worship, and then maybe once a month they would have like an evensong service or something like that. So it felt a little bit like a loosening to the PCA church that we attended. I mean, there were more visibly people who were, diverse than the OPC church. Also a bit larger, more people in attendance, lots of families. That sort of thing.
Gotcha. So being at the PCA, like you said, we were even talking before this and now during, that you don't really notice how the church works until something wrong happens at the church.
Yeah.
So can you talk about when you started noticing, and this also dives into your personal life as well, when things weren't going right in your marriage, and then how that was being treated by the session, because like you said, it's it's things go great until they don't, and it's sometimes when the session gets involved that you realize the real culture of this church too.
Yeah, it was when, so I had a difficult marriage with my ex-husband for probably several reasons, but one of which is he was not a truthful person, and he was, looking back, he would try to get the things he wanted through manipulation and kind of abusive tactics, if I put it very broadly. And so we had trouble pretty early on in our marriage, and I had gone for help in the OPC. And when I say I went for help, I asked for help, and what we got are a couple of pastoral visits. They came to our house and they talked to us for a bit. There was no recommendation to go to counseling or, significantly change anything. It was just like, you two should spend more time together. And maybe, Colleen, maybe you shouldn't be so opinionated because that seems to bother your husband. Mm-hmm. So things had been rough in the OPC. Things had been rough in my marriage, and the OPC didn't seem to really help. I went to the PCA, and things kind of improved because, we're in a new location, kind of the excitement of that. And then we had become members in 2015. I want to say it was 2015 at the PCA church. We had become members. My husband was ordained to the PCA, I'm going to say in May. And then in September, I had discovered that he was sexting with a coworker that, it was kind of like a coworker / employee situation. There was a young woman in Egypt who was working on translation work for Third Millennium Ministries. And I discovered that he had been he had been sexting with her. And from what I can tell, I don't really speak very good Arabic. I read even less of it. But from what I can tell from the conversation, he was, kind of coercing her into this, whatever. I don't even know if you would call it a relationship. He had coerced her into this. So I had discovered this one morning on his phone, and it was shocking and betraying, and also kind of a relief at the same time, which is a weird way to describe it to somebody. But I had so much trouble in my marriage, didn't get any help in the OPC. We're in the PCA, it's a different church. It seems like these people might be more willing to help. And I have a very explicit situation that I can point to that says, hey, this is not working. There's something wrong. I need help. My husband needs help. My husband needs accountability. We need something from the PCA. So, so I had gone to the head pastor at the time. His name was Frank Cavalli, and the associate pastor, whose name is Justin Borger. And I had asked for help. And I think I had written this open letter a while ago that kind of sums up well this how things went, with my encounter with me going to the PCA to asking for help. And so I'm going to pivot and just read a little bit from this.
Yeah, please do.
Yep. So fine, in this letter that I had published a few years ago, I wrote, finally, I could get help, real help, even professional marriage counseling. So I went to my pastor, Frank Cavalli, and my assigned elder, Justin Borger, at St. Paul's, asking for help and accountability for my husband. I was told the Central Florida Presbytery's minister and his work committee would be providing oversight because Sharif was the name of my then husband. Sharif was ordained, right? So he's in the PCA. He's not a member of the local church. He's a member of the Presbytery. So the minister and his work committee would be providing oversight and accountability for Sharif. Just a few months later, the committee voted to transfer the oversight back to the session of St. Paul's. And then what ensued over the next 3 years nearly destroyed my mental and physical health and my faith. In response to increased attention from St. Paul's Church, Sharif's emotional and spiritual abuse escalated. When I reached out to Pastor Justin, my assigned elder at St. Paul's, he both encouraged me to look to Christ in my suffering, and also he laughed at me when I told him I was afraid of my husband. Pastor Cavalli, Pastor Frank, sympathized with my situation and recognized how unreasonable my husband could be in specific situations, but he told me to submit, because that was my role as wife. It was just to submit to whatever he wanted, no matter how unreasonable, no matter how cruel, no matter what it cost me. So we did get counseling, and we saw two different marriage counseling. One was a woman who I judge her to be fairly inept because she questioned my mental state during a joint marital counseling, which my, at the time, husband then used to cast aspersions on anything I ever said. You know, you can't trust what Colleen says. She's depressed. She's crazy. She's something, right? And I also, when counseling with that woman did not work out, we were referred to Dr. Jim Cofield, who was the head of the counseling department at RTS in Oviedo. He was completely bewildered by me and my husband. When Dr. Cofield wouldn't believe my protestations that my husband was lying during the sessions, I would drive home from those sessions sobbing. You know, and to kind of insert a little bit of additional commentary here, finally get counseling from the head of the counseling department at RTS, right, in Orlando. Somebody I should be able to trust. And I mean, it was an incredibly frustrating situation because I would be truthful and honest in these counseling sessions, owning up to the things I did, the sinful ways I reacted to my then husband's abuse. And I tried to be warts and all because I wanted help so desperately. And my husband would be sitting in the same sessions and he would pour poison into Dr. Cofield's ear. And Dr. Cofield was like, I don't know what's going on here. This is so bizarre. I can't figure it out. And it's like, well, he's lying. I mean, I don't understand. He's lying. You know, I'm not a counselor. I don't pretend to be one on TV. Maybe that's what counselors do. I don't know. But it was, gosh, those are some of the most soul destroying sessions of everything. You know, you go to get help and be vulnerable. And I'd walk out of those sessions, you know, having listened to my husband lie about how situations went and the person across the room nodding their head. Like, yes, of course, Colleen is unreasonable. You know. So to continue with my open letter, in March 2017, Sharif kicked in our bedroom door, which I had locked during an argument. I had locked it to get away from him, and he kicked it in. The next morning, I went to a lawyer to get a restraining order, but Pastor Justin talked me out of it. I ended up following up with the lawyer. The lawyer's like, you're going to regret not filing this restraining order. It doesn't stop. The best advice I got with dealing with my abusive husband came from that lawyer through the whole situation. Was, you know, a guy who just wanted to help me out by filing a restraining order so I could start the process of leaving. But, you know, Pastor Justin had talked me out of filing the restraining order. He assured me that the minister and his work committee would handle Sharif. His comment was like, let them deal with Sharif. Don't go the legal route. Let them deal with Sharif. So I had sent an email to the head of that committee, who is Dan Thompson, who ended up being a pastor at St. Paul's later on. And the response that I got back from him was an email stating he wasn't really certain what I expected the committee to do. So, you know, year and a half into it, and they're like, the response I get back is like, well, what do you want us to do? So counseling continued without effect and then petered out when I asked Pastor Justin, about writing a letter to the minister and his work committee about the ongoing abuse I was experiencing. He said he'd look into it. Later, I asked very specifically, like, okay, how do I start the judicial process within the PCA of like bringing charges against my husband, right? Because he's continuing to be a teaching elder. in the Presbyterian. Like, he's continuing to have that role and work on his PhD at Westminster. Like, there seemed to be no restriction on him throughout all of this. And so I asked, like, okay, what do I do about bringing charges against my husband to the church, to the presbytery? He said he investigated, and then he never followed up with me. In August 2018, 2 years after I first sought help from the session of St. Paul's, I attempted to renew reconciliation attempts with my husband, with Pastor Justin and a ruling elder, whose name is John Maynard. After 2 meetings in 4 months with them and my husband, in which my husband refused to agree on any steps towards reconciliation, I completely gave up. I think our last meeting was like late November, maybe early December 2018. Nothing. And it was at that point that I came to the realization that, like, they don't want to help. Like, their idea of help was to get me to accept this terrible lot in life that I had been given and stop talking about it. Like, stop pestering them. They weren't interested in actually coming alongside me as I went through this, or holding my husband accountable for his behavior. And so I kind of gave up. Still attended St. Paul, still was active in St. Paul's. I was in the choir, attended all the women's events, lots of friends. You know, there was like a small group I was part of. Continued to do all of that. And then in February of 2019, I got a phone call from Pastor Justin. It was the day before Valentine's Day, saying that now that he was the head pastor, Pastor Frank had left. I don't remember if he retired or what exactly he did, but he was no longer the head pastor. Pastor Justin was now the head pastor. He called me to say that my case was essentially being reassigned to ruling elder John Maynard, who is somebody that I had come to dislike and not trust through the course of our interactions. And it was at that point that I realized, like, I'm done. I'm done with the PCA. I'm done with this session. I'm done with everything. So it was at that point that I realized that the session had no intention of helping me in any meaningful way. And so I began to attend a local non-denominational church, like a non-denom church right up the road, that I could attend in peace without my still abusive husband. Because that was the thing. Going through all of this, right? I'm dealing with my abusive husband, and he's sitting next to me in church on the Sundays that we take communion together. And I know that it's broken. He knows that it's broken. He doesn't feel that there's anything for him to repent for. And then we take communion together. So I left. I left, and I found sanctuary in this large non-denominational church. And so I started attending there. I think it was mid-February. And then I ended up joining that church in April. And that is what started off the entire judicial procedure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So can you, because like I said, your case is interesting because, I mean, I'll preview it. You do win this procedure, but I think people are like, oh, great, she won. So, like, what's there to talk about? But then that's the very thing that you want to talk about, because what does it even matter?
Yeah, exactly. So, I left the PCA. I joined this local non-denominational church. And I had gotten some advice from another PCA elder who, he had mentioned, he's like, you're probably going to run into difficulty with this particular session because they're exhibiting behaviors of control, and yet also at the same time kind of like a hands-off attitude towards things. So he coached me on what to do in order to leave the PCA properly, and also walked through the entire judicial procedure with me. So I'm going to continue with my open letter. Mm-hmm. So I attended membership classes at the non-denom, and I joined on April 7th, 2019. The next day, I wrote to Pastor Justin and, Elder John Maynard and the St. Paul's clerk, advising that I had joined a new church and had withdrawn from the PCA. And I quoted the BCO, the Book of Church Order, in my letter to them, in particular 38.3a, which allowed me to leave as a member in good standing. On April 12th, R.E. John Maynard attempted to file charges against me for seeking to divorce her husband, Sheree, for unbiblical reasons. I only found this out later looking at the session notes. Like, I had no idea any of this was happening. On April 23rd, my husband appeared before the session at one of their stated meetings and lied to them, stating that I had joined another church because I was planning on divorcing him without the session's approval. I had no idea that any of this had happened until I saw the session notes months later. And this is just flatly not true. Like, in April of 2019, like, I was still under the impression that I could just kind of like bifurcate my life and remain married to this man. Like, I could do this. Like, I could, just kind of disassociate and break off emotionally and just kind of, go into like uber protective turtle mode and just stay in this safe little confinement and stay in this marriage, as long as I possibly could, because marriage is important, right? So when I see in the notes that, my husband goes to this session and she's like, and says, Colleen is going to divorce me, and that's why she's leaving. He's just lying. He's just lying. Over the next 5 months, so I sent the letter at the beginning of April. Over the next 5 months, there was correspondence back and forth with Pastor Justin and the session of St. Paul's, including a meeting on July 10th, in which the session asked for more time to come up with a plan to deal with Sharif and provide me with support. So almost 3 years later, they're like, please don't leave. We promise, cross our fingers, cross our heart, hope to die. We'll come up with a plan. Like 3 years of this, and suddenly they're going to come up with a plan. I didn't believe their promises to help, so I declined and I moved out of the family townhouse at the end of the month. So at the end of July 2019 is when I actually left to separate. So in August, the session voted to remove me from the membership rolls of St. Paul's as an act of pastoral discipline, which is essentially a soft form of excommunication, right? So I don't go through a big trial and am found guilty. They're just going to say, hey, we're taking you off the rolls. You're not a Christian anymore. Goodbye. As part of this, I don't mention this in my open letter, but as part of this, they do read out to the members during a membership meeting that I have been removed from the rolls and I am no longer a Christian. So as part of this, it's not just like a procedural thing where they send you a letter and say, by the way, you're out. They actually read this to the entire congregation. So on September 5th, 2019, 3 years after I initially sought help with my husband, I filed a complaint against the action of St. Paul's. When St. Paul's refused to rule on my complaint, which in the BCO, you can't refuse. You either uphold, like you sustain or deny it. You can't just say, no, we're not going to rule on it. So when St. Paul's refused to rule on my complaint, I carried it to the Central Florida Presbytery. When Central Florida Presbytery denied it, I brought it to the Standing Judicial Commission, or, the General Assembly. The Standing Judicial Commission being that group that handles complaints on behalf of the GA. I ended up filing for divorce in November 2019. And my SJC hearing finally occurred in June 2020. Obviously, the months leading up to that is when COVID hit. So it was a bit delayed because of that. The initial proposed ruling from the SJC was in my favor, but it ended up being rewritten and my complaint sent back to the Central Florida Presbytery in February of 2021. Central Florida Presbytery remanded my complaint down to the session of St. Paul's, who in turn denied it a second time in May of 2021. I carried my complaint back up to the Central Florida Presbytery, and finally, in December of 2021, I argued my case at a Presbytery committee panel hearing to adjudicate my complaint, and the panel ruled in my favor. The complaint process was arduous, fiddly, and nearly opaque to me as a layperson. Additionally, it focused solely on one action by St. Paul's, which was the removal from the rolls as an act of pastoral discipline. Nothing I had experienced in the 3 years prior was in scope, either from my husband or from St. Paul's. You know, all of the paperwork that I generated, all the arguments, all the hearings, it was all simply about that one action of St. Paul's, is that they removed me from the rolls as an act of pastoral discipline. Nothing about, mishandling or the lack of care that I got from St. Paul's or anything with my husband factored into my complaint at all. Someone might say, but you just had like a bad or incompetent or a bunkling session. There's no need to change the BCO. There's nothing wrong with the BCO. Someone might say, no lay PCA member knows they have a bad session until they discover it. I watched Pastor Justin and ruling elder John Maynard malign my character and lie by omission during those hearings. They failed to mention any of the abuse I suffered or the inciting incident, discovering the sexting my husband, that led me to seek their help as they compiled the record of the case, filed briefs with the SJC and Central Florida Presbytery, and argued during hearings before both judicial bodies. I have no idea what was said about me in private or at stated Presbyterian meetings. I'm a layperson. I'm not welcome in either of those venues. After the panel ruled in my favor, I received no correspondence or updates from St. Paul's stating that they had complied with the Presbytery's decision until I emailed the session clerk in March of 2021. The confirmation that I got back was an email, just an email that said, as it stated at its stated meeting on January 18th, 2022, the session of St. Paul's adopted the following motion. The church is to abide by the ruling of the Central Florida Judicial Commission on the complaint of Miss Colleen Gendy versus the session of St. Paul's Presbyterian Church. That's it. That's it. There's a sentence in church notes. Years of work, all the waiting, all the prayers, all the suffering and the loneliness, and losing my friends and community. And in the end, St. Paul's couldn't even be bothered to send me anything on church letterhead. They sent me all the correspondence that they sent me. They emailed me. They sent me paper copies on church letterhead. They signed off their letters, Sola Deo Gloria, all of this. And then in the end, when they're shown to be wrong, all I get is like a sentence from church notes. Even after my ex-husband was deposed and excommunicated by the Central Florida Presbytery in April 2022, and I've got a postscript from the Presbytery about his removal from ministry. Even after that, I've not received an apology or an acknowledgement of any failings by anyone at St. Paul's. I've been informed by, a few PCA elders that St. Paul's has been marked as a problematic and unsafe church by various PCA TEs and RAs. But when I wrote this, which was, I think, June of 2022, that previous spring, they had added 57 new members. Just that new spring, or just that most recent spring, 57 new members. The real success story is that I escaped the PCA, that I'm done, I'm out, and I'm just not going to go back. I can't ever go back.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that first and foremost. And it also shows people you can go through the entirety of the process and the things that are expected of you. I mean, generally speaking, women, particularly speaking, women, A lot more is expected of you than they are ever willing to give themselves, even when they're on the losing side of this
Yeah.
battle. Can you, before we conclude, can you talk to those listening about why it seems like they were so much on your husband's side and not on your side, even though you had all the evidence, you went through all the proper channels, and yet it still seemed that the church sided with your husband through all of this. And you were told to submit more or to suffer like Christ had suffered. Can you go through that a little bit?
Yeah. It's something I've thought about off and on for the past 5 years, going on 6 years. And I think when it really comes down to it, it's a deep and abiding patriarchal understanding of what men and women are and what marriage and who marriage is for. Reflecting on it and thinking about how everybody behaved and on the whole, I think that the session of St. Paul's, the pastors that I spoke to, put all of my mistreatment into the category of the lot of the wife. You're a wife. You are expected to submit. And as part of that, you don't get to define what is or is not acceptable behavior. Now, if I'm fair, they would say, if you show up with bruises or a broken arm, obviously that's unacceptable behavior. But short of that, you're a wife. Your lot is to deal with whatever your husband doles out. So if he wants to treat you poorly, if he wants to systematically tear down who you are as a person, any sense of personhood, if he wants to isolate you from friends, if he wants to find a single woman at the church that you can talk to about all of your problems and she be your only friend, that's all acceptable behavior. Because he's the husband and he has the rights to make those determinations. You might not like it, but as a wife, the extent of your rights are to submit. That's it. And it's a patriarchal understanding of men and women and marriage, and ultimately what I really believe is it's an outworking of the curse in Genesis 3:16, in which a woman's desire will be for her husband, but he will rule over her. We want to be with our husbands. We want to be married to them. We love them. We want the relationships to work, but he'll turn around and he'll rule over you. And it's cruel. And, the patriarchal understanding that I think that I dealt with in that church had no boundaries for saying, nope, this is not okay. They just don't, because if the husband chooses to be cruel, well, I guess that's that.
Yeah, and I'll peek at a episode we have coming up, which this is helpful. This is helpful for that one too. It's the whole judicial and church order process of bringing discipline or bringing charges. Like you said, it is incredibly complex. Yeah. And so often the payoff, like you said, even if you do win, the payoff is a single little note saying this is what happened, and no apology, no repentance, even though they have no problem excommunicating you in front of the entire congregation, but they themselves, when found to be wrong, will not do the same, saying, hey, we messed up, to the congregation, which I imagine would speak volumes to the congregation, say, hey, we screwed up on this case, and now we're going to make it better because we screwed up, and here's the things that we're going to do to make sure that we don't make this mistake again in the future.
Yeah. And that would be, I mean, if I got an apology if I had some sort of inkling that they were learning from my experience, if they were adjusting how they dealt with other women in abusive marriages in their church, if there was some sort of inkling that they were growing, it would almost make my experience worth it, because I'm out, I'm done, I'm free. I've got to spend the last 6 years healing from this whole mess, and I'm in such a better place than I was. And if things could be better for the next woman after me, it would redeem my experience in some small way. Like that would be one of those things where I could say, out of this horrible situation came something good. Based on conversations that I have been privy to with current members at the church going through abusive marriages, that hasn't been the case. So 6 years later, it doesn't seem that any of them have chosen to re-examine their positions or learn from my experience at all.
Yeah. Yep. And to summarize before concluding, it's sometimes we are accused of this, or people come on the series accused of this, but people don't know the full picture, nor just how many channels they went through. You went through everything. You went through all the proper channels. You followed the Book of Church Order. You followed all the disciplinary hearings. You adjudicated correctly. You talked to the session. You brought it to Presbyterian. It was brought to all the things that bring a charge against your elder. You followed that stuff. You like that. This is exactly what I'm going to do. And then, even though you win, like I said, like, kind of what's the point? Yeah,
I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, honestly. Having been out of Presbyterianism for this long, being in another denomination that has actually a much more robust disciplinary procedure, I don't. Unless your disciplinary procedures are primarily for keeping your ordained people, the people in authority, in check, I don't think that discipline is being used correctly. And so the recommendations that I would give to any woman or any man who finds themselves under spiritual abuse, or, finding that their church is not supportive as they're trying to get out of an abusive marriage, is to not bother. It was so much work. It was so much emotional output. It consumed so much of my life. And in the end, it's crass, but it's like a fart in a large room. It's there for a moment and it's gone. It meant nothing. It meant nothing. And so, especially for women who are getting out of troubled marriages, I would say don't bother. Like if you are very serious about leaving, try to find an actual lawyer who'd be willing to type up a letter for you, ending your membership at your local church, something that actually has like legal teeth, and then just walking away entirely. Don't even bother going through the church court system, because it doesn't mean anything. That would be my recommendation.
All right. So to conclude, any final thoughts from Colleen for, like you said, even those women who are listening and wondering, is this what's happening to me, or is this happening to one of my friends, or for pastors who are like, how do we do this better? Even haters who hate listening to this is like, well, like maybe she did something wrong, or maybe they're right and she's just bitter. So if you can conclude, any final thoughts, if you want to cover this stuff at all, or what Colleen wants to leave listeners with specifically.
Yeah, I think for women who are in conservative Christian churches who are trying to figure out what's going on with their marriages and what's going on with the church, you're not wrong. Listen to your gut and try to find somebody who is not part of your church environment to weigh in on your situation. Getting an outside perspective is hugely beneficial and confirming, to find, for somebody who's not in it up to their necks, to look around and say, your pastor's crazy. You should not be expected to submit to this. It's a huge benefit. So try to look outside of your immediate confines for help and assistance. It's there, it exists, you can find it. To the session of St. Paul's or other similarly positioned sessions in the PCA and the OPC. I think the thing I would say is if you pride yourself on your theological prowess and accuracy and conformity to the confessions, but you cannot find your way to supporting women who are in difficult marriages, you might want to reconsider whether or not your theological ideas are as sound as you think they are. If your theological understanding of marriage requires that women just sacrifice themselves to this institution and be quiet and take it, then it might be time to really consider whether or not that theological framework that you've put over the institution of marriage is actually from God. And for the people in like the church members of St. Paul's, the people who aren't in difficult marriages, who maybe see somebody dealing with an abusive situation and not getting help from the churches, I think about all of the friends that I was very candid with about the difficulties that I had with St. Paul's, who remained and stayed there, even though they knew I was right, they agreed with me. If I think about all the people who stayed, I think I would ask them to just reassess why that is. You know, why do you continue to give your time and money and attention and support to a session and a church that continues to harm the vulnerable members of its own congregation? Because I think in the end, all of us will have to give an accounting for our behavior, the session, the individuals within the marriages, and all of the bystanders, because by choosing to remain at that church, you are saying something. You are making a type of declaration. And it might be time to reconsider that as well.
Next, we move to Megan Owen, formerly counseled by Jim Wilson, the late father of Doug Wilson. This interview will include language about severe abuse she and her kids suffered at the hands of her ex-husband, so I urge extreme caution when listening. The counseling center she founded, Mountain City Christian Counseling, is a result of her experience and training. I highly recommend it and her, and she'll talk about it at the end of the interview. Let's talk to Megan.
My name is Megan Owen, and I am a survivor of domestic violence, and I am now a pastoral trauma counselor for other survivors of domestic violence. I came to know Jim Wilson as a little girl, Doug's father. He ran in the circles of the OCF, or Officers Christian Fellowship. My parents were Air Force. My father was an Air Force officer, and we were an Air Force family. And my parents ran Bible studies every week for as long as I can remember that we're connected to this group, OCF. It was a great family group. It's where I still have all of my closest friends from when I was young, in the late 70s and throughout the 80s and even into the early 90s. We would go on an affordable family vacation. We would meet with other Christian officers and their families, and then they would have invited speakers to these retreat centers. And Jim Wilson was one who was oft invited. He had written a book on bitterness that my parents loved. And it is purported that he led my father to Christ when I was 2 years old. My parents had divorced. He led my father to Christ. My parents remarried a year later. And so he was pivotal in our family, but I wasn't all that close to him. And when I was 24, my siblings and I lost our parents in a car accident. And some of the adults from that community surrounded us, came and walked with us. And a couple of those were counselors, Jim Wilson being one of them. And so I sort of got to know him again. He was there for me, and I got married really quickly. I went to East Coast, went to Liberty University to finish my school. Within a couple months, within the first month, I met my husband, and he came from a Mennonite, Russianish, Baptist background. And I would consider it a cult, hands down. Cult. But I thought he was going to be a great husband, and he wanted to be a missionary. And I mistook his possessiveness for being protective. I met his family in Germany and thought, oh, I could have a family. I had all these gaps in my life and all of this pain. And also I am on the autism spectrum, and it felt safe for me to be with him because he ran the show. Also, in the culture of which I was a part of at Liberty Baptist, that was taught. He was supposed to run the show. He was supposed to lead. So we got married a little over a year after my parents died. And I knew on our wedding night that I'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. But I had been steeped in the focus on the family culture, which was 10 minutes from our home. Divorce was not an option in our family. And so I stayed for another 11 years, was married 12 years. During that time, I had 4 kids, 4 C-sections, because we're supposed to multiply and fill the earth. And I homeschooled. I did my best to honor my abusive husband. Makeup was looked down on. It was better to wear skirts. Jewelry was bad. And his family never liked me. They had nicknames for me that included things like whiny wife in German. And I tried to leave him the first time when I had 4 kids, 5 and under. One of them was a newborn. My kid's father had a massive porn addiction that I was unaware of until 6 years into our marriage. Our marriage was incredibly destructive. He did not see me as a human. I had no dignity. We had no normal, honest communication, emotional intimacy, exchanges. I was an object in every way. And my kids were an extension of him. I could take up a lot of time talking about the abuses that my children and I suffered, of which I didn't even have a name. I didn't even use that word abuse. Right? I just thought I was just trying to honor God. I was trying to be a godly woman. And anyway, the first time I tried to leave, word got around to this group of people, these officers who had kind of rallied around me, and a couple of them drove down. General and his wife, General and Mrs. Buckingham, drove down to be from Pennsylvania to be with my husband at the time. And my phone wouldn't stop ringing. You need to go back. This is sinful. And I didn't even have I didn't have any language. I just knew that I was dead on the inside by this point. And I felt like nobody heard me and nobody cared. And the fact that I was dead on the inside seemed to be my fault. And I couldn't figure out what to fix. I tried so many things, like so much. I went to so many counselors, and they would tell, they took me through this book that identified all of my sin so that I could confess it and repent and do better. At one point, I was told by Jim Wilson when we first started marriage counseling with him that I did not need to talk to God directly. I just needed to talk to my husband.
Okay.
And I don't know if anybody knows what that feels like. I'm sure a lot of people know what that feels like. It feels like you are a non-human. You go numb, you become a shell, a robot. And you cover it with toxic positivity and joy in air quotes. And you stuff down your own self, your own image of God, your own personality, because your eternity is at stake here. So I left. I got this call from Jim Wilson telling me that it's obvious I'm not a Christian and I need to go back. I called my grandmother. She was not supportive. I didn't really have anybody else to call because I was in seminary land, Southeastern by this point, in Wake Forest, North Carolina, and nobody was going to support my kids and me. I didn't have any money. I had 4 small kids, and hours later, I went back. And that night, some of those folks from OCF watched our kids, and we went to dinner. And my kid's father reached his arms out for me and held onto my elbows and pulled me in across the table really tightly. And he said, I know you will never disappoint God like that again. And I think I knew, a part of me knew in that minute that my life was going to be hell going forward. And it was. It was 3 more years of hell, only worse. Because then we moved overseas to be with his family. And my kids and I were completely boxed in. I was so afraid. And I couldn't speak the language. So at that time, Jim Wilson became our regular marriage counselor. He loved the idea of us moving to Germany because then my husband could really lead me because I was too strong-willed. I wasn't submissive enough. And now if we move to Germany, then I won't have a chance to have a will because I couldn't speak the language. I was the outsider, and boy, did I feel it. When we got to Germany, his family, that was going to be my family, treated me like trash. Because when I left that day, a couple years before then, he called them and told them all how crazy I was and what a Jezebel I was and what a sinful woman I was. And to them, the fact that I left that day, that was the worst thing any woman could ever do. And they treated me like trash. And they treated my kids like trash too. So our sessions with Jim Wilson upped. I would call him crying. I would call him scream crying. He would tell me I was being sinful. There was a time I couldn't get out of bed. He told me I was being sinful. There was a time where the gaslighting got to be too much and he said, I just need to believe my husband. And I started to feel like I was crazy. He would show me scriptures such as scripture from Isaiah where women were commanded not to wear gold or jewelry or prance around being, I don't know, he thought it was arrogant for me to wear makeup or jewelry or anything like that, that I was being haughty. That was the word he used, Haughty. I was haughty. And he was very focused on salvation. So at the time, my ex-husband got saved over and over, and then I was supposed to just start everything over with a new clean slate. With so much attention and supervision on my kid's father, he wasn't able to really manage. It was like everyone was on him. Our pastor of our church was calling him every day, "Are you abusing your wife?" My friends who spoke English, they were paying attention now because they recognized bruises on my kids and me. I was honest for the first time with her about everything that was happening. So they were involved, and then Jim Wilson was involved. And it got to a breaking point. And Jim Wilson gave me permission. It was so bad. He gave me permission to take a break from the marriage. So 3 days later, their father did something so bad to one of my kids that my newly turned 9-year-old son was trying to stand up to him with his martial arts training. And the next day we were on a plane. My friend Dorothy and her husband bought us tickets to come back to Denver. And the kids took their Bible and one toy, and we packed summer clothes for 2 weeks. And I lost everything in that trip. But we never went back. And by the time I landed here in Colorado, he had called all my family. And the implications of that are so great that 12, 13 years later, we still don't talk. He reported back to me how they all said I was crazy and needed counseling, and they were very public about their condemnation of me. Here's what I didn't understand was going to happen, Peter. I didn't understand that some of the worst abuse was about to happen once I landed back in the US. I was not prepared for the harassment that came, for everybody's opinions shoved at me, for people showing up at my door that Jim Wilson had sent to our house where I was staying. I wasn't prepared for just this network that my own family created, following my every move and even reaching out to people who lived around me. I had no money, no resources to fight it. I didn't even know I could because I was so spiritually brainwashed. I thought I was going to hell. And then I just received email after email from Jim Wilson and other people he had contacted, like people close to me. I lost 98% of my childhood friends because of my own family and Jim. And when you're trying to make ends meet and you have no support, and you have 4 little kids, and your own family gossips and harasses and doesn't even ask what happened, just assumes I'm lying. I just remember like literally holding my head together because I thought I was going to break. And asking God to please just let me live long enough to raise the kids so that they could go to heaven. Because it had been made clear to me that I was not a proper Christian. And when I suffered those first 2 years, it really almost broke me. And I went and wished on my worst enemy. And the bravest thing I ever did in my life, the most noble, courageous act of rescuing my children, that's how I saw it, was made to be a sinful, arrogant, controlling act on my part because I wanted to be a feminist or something like that. Why would anybody choose the path that I took? Why would you choose that? I didn't have a choice. I didn't feel like I had a choice. That was the only choice I had. And I got emails from Jim Wilson for a good 18 months. And I was like trying to be respectful because, you know, you respect your elders. And one of those emails that I wish I had saved, but I didn't, said that I was the problem. And he pointed at all the people who had come up against me that I had lost. My family, his family, friends. And it was time for me to just admit that I am the problem. And there were some very dark days that I needed to live for my kids. And I know so many moms who know exactly what I'm talking about.
So with Jim Wilson, because your story revolves around Jim, and those who don't know, Jim is Doug Wilson's father. Can you talk about maybe when did you start noticing like, hey, this Jim guy is not just not a good counselor. He's a horrible counselor. He's not helping me. He's hurting me. Like when did that start? When did that start cropping up for you? And when or if, I mean, did you make a connection to this broader patriarchal or obedience and submission and authority culture that revolves around these circles too?
It took me a long time I didn't know any of this language. I didn't know patriarchy. I didn't know misogyny. I didn't know abuse. I thought so little of myself that I wasn't even looking in those directions. But a friend of mine, sort of a lone wolf voice in my life that I'd known from college, I sent him one of the emails that I got from Jim. And he said, "Oh my gosh, this man is crazy. This is insane. This is awful." And here's what he recommended. He said, "Why don't you start a blog and just post that email?" And I was so scared. And that blog no longer exists, but I was so scared because I'd already been so harassed and shut down and discredited. So, but I did it. And people commented. I don't know, like 10 or 12 people said, "Wow, this is crazy. This isn't right. You can't listen to this." And that cracked the door enough for me to begin to believe that maybe it wasn't me. just outside perspectives. I'd been in this bubble for so long. So just hearing other people who were like normal people or reading this from them started me thinking that maybe this wasn't a good thing anyway, because there was no good fruit from it. It was dogmatic. It was exclusive. It was exclusive. It was unattainable. It was degrading, dehumanizing, and people saw it. They noticed it. And then Jim started like attacking those people, like they're not of God and I shouldn't be listening to them. But here was the final, I think, straw for me was that same friend said, Megan, when I was young, we took in a woman from a cult who'd had a baby and had that baby taken away from her, and we were trying to help her. My parents were trying to help her. He said, every photo I look at of her, she had the most empty eyes and blank expression. And he said, your photos are starting to look like that. And then he sent me an article on the the top characteristics of a cult. And that blew my mind. That blew my mind. And then everything started to change, but it was not without struggle. I once did a painting of a woman trying to rise up above, holding a balloon in a white dress. And she's trying to rise up above all of this darkness. But there were these like demonic claws that were reaching up, trying to pull her down. It was hard. It was hard to reprogram myself. I was so afraid. I can't describe that spiritual abuse kind of fear of you're going to go to eternal conscious torment. Or you're going to be in your own personal hell here with this man. Like, what do you do with that? You know?
Yeah. So going further into this and be as detailed or not as you wish to be. When Jim hears about your marriage and what's happening between you and your ex-husband, and he obviously is putting the blame on you, maybe like why does he put the blame on you? If your husband's being abusive, what about this kind of cultural matrix, this theological agenda, whatever it is, and even though you may not have had this framework to understand this, why was it placed on you? What if he's being abusive, why are you the one at fault? What does Jim see for him to say, yeah, it's you?
Right. So Jim would admit that I was being abused and that he was abusing the children. But he also, I think, felt like I had too strong a personality or something, like I wasn't submissive enough. Okay, so I would be more submissive. I did try to go have my husband as Lord. You know, I did try those things. And it was spiritual death is what it was. And so I had permission to leave as long as I came back. And I remember somebody saying to me, Jesus didn't die for your marriage. He died for you, and you're not living. You're dying on the inside. You don't even want to live anymore. And so I think there's this marriage worship. But it's really just control, right? Like, if we can have the man be the head of the household and the women have to submit, then we get to keep our control. And that's just a tale as old as time. But we don't live in those times anymore. And I've never been the type of person who can manage being controlled, at least not anymore, especially. But the fact that I didn't go back, I was supposed to go back to him. He was changing and I was no unforgiving. And I even remember Jim saying things like, if you don't forgive 70 times 7, then then, or he would use scriptures such as the Lord's Prayer. It was, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And he said, if you don't forgive him, you are not forgiven by God. It was just spiritual abuse heaped upon spiritual abuse heaped on. And that's why I talk about my brain almost breaking, because I believed those things at the time, but I also knew I had to keep my kids safe.
Yeah. So what was his solution? You have a marriage problem, big time, abuse, everything. He acknowledges the abuse, although he puts the blame on you. Even if it's a small amount of blame, he still puts blame on you. What was the solution? Like, what was the solution to say, hey, Megan, this is the key to an abuse-free marriage. This is what you got to do for your husband. Was there anything of that coming for him? And if so, what was it, or was it helpful at all?
Well, early on, he did a lot of that. It really centered my husband and his needs. And, he would even recommend I took a nap during the day so I could fully cater to my husband's needs when he comes home, because I had so many little kids. It was silly stuff like that, like as though I could fix my ex-husband's porn problems by just being, thinner and tidier and wear cuter clothes. I mean, seriously, he said things like that. And then toward the end, when he wanted me to go back, I remember this very well. It was, I think he wanted me to be sort of filleted open and live in a state of constantly forgiving my husband, and that I would be abused and I would be used and I would be Jesus to him by constantly forgiving and living in that place of forgiveness. And that would be my life. And I would be like a living sacrifice.
So not so much a solution, more so just, hey, you can image Jesus in your suffering marriage.
That was it. That was where he landed over and over. He used scripture for that too.
Gotcha. Are you, how aware are you of Doug and his own pastoral counseling or marriage counseling, or how he has talked to marriage couples or to women who are abused or to children who are abused or those in his orbit who've done the same thing? How aware are you of that? Because you've seen it in his father, and it's not like Doug doesn't get it from somewhere. It's the apple doesn't fall far from the trees. I'm curious. You've been under Jim's counseling. What have you seen? What did you see from Doug?
Well, he talked about Doug a lot. He talked about his wife, Betsy. He got me involved in all of the blogs, like the woman blog, Doug's wife, Nancy's blog. I remember something from that. Doug's blog and Doug's books on marriage and headship. And I read all the things and kind of tried to immerse myself in it, thinking that was the answer. I even probably brought it to other people too. Like, this is what I'm doing. It was just, that was the culture. That was the Southern Baptist culture at the time, very conservative. And would have these discussions with other women. One of the things that I did notice about the comments on Doug's blog and how he moderated and treated people, it was sort of like, if women didn't speak to other women about submitting to men, you couldn't be part of that group. Like, that's what we talked about. And so at the time, 12, 13 years ago, he was kind of up and coming. I know that Jim talked about his children whenever he would speak. When I was younger, they were younger, and he would talk about them. I remember him talking about Heather and how she met her missionary husband. And my impression of Doug was that they created their own theological grid that worked for them and took it to its logical conclusion. And that's what they still do. And there's no love in it. I remember on Nancy's blog, I said to her, I married an abusive man, and I don't know what to do. She said, then why did you marry him? There's no compassion. If you don't fit into that theological grid, you may as well bury your head in dirt. That's what I know. And I know that Doug and his dad were very close. And obviously, again, what Doug has done and is doing, it came from his dad. It had to have. And I mean, who knows what the issues are there and why he felt he needed to do all of that, but I've heard about him insisting that young girls stay married to abusers or get married to abusers. Women don't have a voice. The sense that I get is that women were God's afterthought and are easily deceived and all this balloon. That's what I know.
Gotcha. And then you sent a few emails, the emails that you do have from Jim before this recording. And one of those that I read, and you had told me before, marked it, was Jim said, hey, why don't you move over to Moscow? We'll set up a safe space over here. Can you talk about that a little bit? Why is he inviting you over there? What's he expect you to find over there? I'm assuming this is after your divorce or in the middle of it. I'm curious.
It was in the middle of it. And so I'm this horrible Jezebel, but then all of a sudden I'm being invited to his home in Moscow. He said he had plenty of room for my kids and me. And he said, I think he invited me a couple times, maybe twice in that email I sent you, or maybe it was a different email, but he said, you can come here. We'll take care of you. Well, by then I was so torn down by him. So that's an odd sort of trick of the mind to tear a woman down to the point where she thinks she's nothing and then invite her to your house. And how weird would that be for me as a woman in her late 30s to have joined Jim Wilson at his house in Moscow? I'm convinced at this point that I would have been just sucked right into the Moscow cult, Yeah. But that's weird, right? Like
that is
neat. Yeah, go ahead.
That's after years of him counseling you and you getting broken down, and then it's odd. You just said it, so it's sparked it. He's been calling you a Jezebel spirit, a haughty woman, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, we have a safe space for you over here. Why don't you come move in Moscow?
Right. By that point, that would be the last thing I would want to do, and it would have ruined my kids and me. Would have wrecked us.
It would have. Absolutely. So, few concluding questions, and then any final thoughts that you want to bring out whatsoever. And I ask these for all the survivors in slightly more particular ways or personalized ways. For somebody like you, who, if you can look back at 25-year-old, 20-year-old Megan, and put your feet into somebody else's shoes now, who's looking at moving to Moscow, who's looking at moving to one of these uber conservative churches, who's looking at joining one of these places that has a very strong headship and submission structure of husband and wife, that has similar counseling ideas. And they're looking at it because they see, or they're like, there's this perceived breakdown of culture, and they want traditionalism, they want conservatism. Culture's going to hell in a handbasket. So we gotta stay true to our roots, true to our traditions. Can you talk to the family or the wife or whoever who is interested in one of these kinds of churches or cultures from your perspective, having lived it?
Absolutely can. And part of that is because I've spent the last 12 years working with women who are on the brink of leaving or who have left through Mountain City Christian Counseling, my practice, and also through my Source program and the nonprofit that I did lead for single mothers who didn't have support like me. So what I would say to a 20-something-year-old who is tempted by the allure of godliness, what I would say is, I know that we live in a culture, and there are a lot of bad things in this world. I know that. A lot of pain. And maybe you were like me, where you just wanted a family. You wanted to feel loved. You've had a lot of loss and hardship in this world, and it looks like it's so great over there. It looks like you'll be protected and cared for. I know that. But they really don't care about you. And it won't take you long, because I trust women. I trust them. And it won't take you long to realize that you're in a really bad spot. We're looking for things to make our lives better, and we should. We should. But resigning yourself to rules and regulations it's not a mature faith. It's not going to be the answer. It's unattainable. And you begin to lose a sense of who you are. If you had any sense of who you are, you have a beautiful, God-given soul that was breathed into you before you were even affected by your parents' biology. And that's in you. It's the image of God. It is the imago Dei. And they will turn you away from yourself over and over and over. And it is so painful, I can't even tell you. There are other ways. There's neighborliness. There's table fellowship. There's developing healthy relationships with those around you. There's healing those parts in you that feel empty. There are other ways. And you can do hard things. There are a lot worse things than being lonely. There's some worse things than being lonely. There are lonelier places within a marriage than when you're alone. And I'm telling you, you don't have to do this. You can find awe, you can find wonder, you can find beauty, and you can live a good life apart from a cult. I know this. There are a lot of things I don't know, but this I know. And I would beg her, and I would hold her, and I would let her cry, and I'd say, I know, you can't do this, though. You can't do this. Please trust me. I've been there.
Maybe you could talk to the second group. You've already approached it. The woman who's in one of these cults or in one of these marriages, and maybe she doesn't have the words for it quite yet. She maybe like you is like, I know something's weird. I can't put my finger on it. But things aren't looking good. I'm losing my personality. I'm losing who I am. But I don't know. I don't know what's happening to me, or she does, and she says, I don't have the courage that Megan had to leave. What might you tell a woman who's in it and trying to figure out, well, what do I do?
And my heart is breaking right now because I know there are so many. And a lot of the things that make us so afraid are finances. How will we support ourselves, our children? Will I lose the people I love? Those are valid fears. And I'm here to tell you that does happen. It does. My kids and I were in poverty for a while. I did not have support. I did lose my people. It was all of that was my greatest fear. And then it happened. It actually happened. And I survived it. And I really feel like I could survive just about anything now because all my biggest fears happened and then I survived. I know that it's scary, but some of my fears were conditioned into me. I didn't know that I could make money on my own. I didn't know that I was intelligent. I didn't know that I was strong and capable of doing these things. And so the fear that I had that I wouldn't be able to support my kids and myself was because they told me I couldn't. And I'm telling you that if you can step out just a little bit, you will find that you have wings. And the door to that cage opens and you're free. And I know it feels like you're stepping off a cliff. I know it. But you are not alone. There are the souls of, I don't know, countless women who have gone before you, who are cheering you on, who believe in you. And there are women who will come after you, who will honor you. I know it's hard. I know you can't see the other side, but there is another side. There is another side. And you will find your people. You will find others like you, like me. There's so many out there. And those are my people now. Those are my family. They are my family now. And it's not going to be easy. It will take time. But I believe in your spirit. And I believe in the spirit that is inside of you, dancing with your spirit.
That's really good. So last thing, I know you've already shared a lot, but if anything else that either I've missed or is particularly on your heart or you want others to hear as well. And then I also want you to plug, I know you already talked about it, Mountain City Christian Counseling, because we're going to plug it in our resources.
Okay.
No,
so I was just mentioning it just in case.
No, absolutely. We're all about it. So any final thoughts, anything that you want people to come away from this conversation with? And then also, if you can, talk about your counseling center, what you guys provide, what's available there, who it's available to, what you guys specialize in. So yeah, please talk about those two things.
Okay. So obviously I had a lot of work to do myself. Once I left, eventually I got a lot of therapy. And I already had a master's in counseling. That's the crazy thing, is I already had it. But I didn't know I could use it. Again, it's crazy how brainwashed we become to believe that, even though I had these qualifications, I wasn't good enough to use them, and I was but a mere woman. So I started and founded my own counseling business called Mountain City Christian Counseling. We are Christian only if people want to be Christian. I specialize in religious abuse. I know all about it. But I work with survivors of all types of abuse: financial, physical, sexual, emotional, mental, all of that abuse. I know what it looks like. I can see it a mile away. I also work with survivors of betrayal trauma, which is women whose husbands are addicted to porn. Some of my clients are married, some are not. Some are trying to get out of their marriage. Others are trying to make it work. I honor and respect the entire person. Their stories are sacred. I hold them gingerly because they are my heroes. These women are my heroes. I know what it takes to do the hard things that they're doing. I do counsel some men, but most of them are women. I offer a program that I wrote myself. It's called SOURCE, and it's an acronym. It's Sacred Self is at the top, then Origin, Understanding. But it's a 3-month course, and it's pretty intensive depending on the package that you buy. But there's one we make very affordable because a lot of my clients are single mothers who are getting out of abuse. Coach Karen does group sessions with a lot of the women that come our way. She is also an author and an abuse survivor herself. And the course, our tagline is bring you home to yourself. So our clients have complex trauma, complex PTSD, and it's difficult to treat. It's sort of death by 1,000 cuts, having been in these abusive situations where they didn't feel they could get away. And so I'm having tremendous success actually with the SOURCE course in helping women to shake some of the paradigms and the spiritual abuse and some of the, reshaping their understanding of scripture, of things that have been turned into directives and law that were not supposed to be, and the fear of changing paradigms. We address all of that, and we work with women to connect to their self, their soul, their own soul. And once that happens, and we start the inner child work, and we do the healing and attachment wounding healing, we have so much success with healing this complex trauma and helping women to be able to connect to themselves and to God and to others. I also do one-on-one counseling with EMDR and developmental needs meeting strategy, which is an ego state therapy.
Anything else you want to add?
I think that's all we've got going on right now. We're about to open up spiritual processing groups, which is sort of a reconstruction, focusing specifically on women. So those are great. I wrote that curriculum as well based on my own journey. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for letting me share about all of that. It is my life's work and passion.
Of course. Yeah. Anything else that you want to share about your story?
Just that, I support my kids. I have my practice. We have a lot of laughter in our house now and singing. We dance in the kitchen. We're the same on the inside as we are on the outside. And we're thriving. The journey was so great.
I would like to thank both Colleen McConnell and Megan Owen for their bravery and transparency. This takes great courage, and both want to see the grace of God magnified in their stories. Listen, I love the church. I love the church, and I want to see her be a place where wounds are treated and loved towards healing, where the gospel is the sweet news of redemption from sin, death, and the devil. When we are convicted by the law, but not beaten down by it, wherein you aren't afraid to confess your sins because you know Jesus covered them and gave you his perfection. Is this what is being preached in your church? The love and righteousness of Christ? Not in comparison to you, but for you. Where having an opinion as a woman is not feared but welcomed, loved, cherished, desired, looked for, believed, and esteemed. Counseling isn't the shepherd's rod that strikes you, but the staff that guides you. Counseling doesn't convince you of how evil you are, but how beloved you are. Counseling that fears worldly practices isn't more biblical, it's just scared of more knowledge. Counseling that's clinically informed doesn't take the side of the victim, but understands their situation. Counseling doesn't seek to expose you, it seeks the flourishing of the human soul made in the image of God. The men in these stories, and so many others, are commissioned, appointed, and charged with feeding the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ to his flock. These men are mandated to care for them. They are mandated to fight the wolves and strike them with the shepherd's rod. But so often the sheep are confused for the wolves, the sheep who fear that the wolves may already be in their midst. And when these sheep point this out, they're met with, "What wolves? Don't you know who's a faithful minister? Don't you know that's a faithful elder? Don't you know how long that man has served this church? Don't you know you were supposed to suffer like Christ suffered?" What is the sheep to do? If you're listening to this and have been hurt, know the faithful shepherd is looking over you. The faithful shepherd loves you. The faithful shepherd sees you. He condemns those who have hurt you, questioned you, and left you in the dark, or placed you in it. You mean the world to him. These men wish to control you. The faithful shepherd wishes to love you. In some small way, I hope you hear that today. Jesus loves you. Before I conclude, I'd like to read a poem from Stephanie Chernyavsky, and a link to that poem will be in the show notes. Behind committees and closed-door councils, wasting on hour by year, sit silly men in emperor's garb with cotton in their ears. The thump, thump smack of a little black book, gavel and noses held high, crocodile tears fall on pompous beards. For this hardened sinner they cry. Whitewashed tomb, silver-plated nickel, shepherds who beat a mauled sheep. Beat the lambs and pet the wolves, they say our souls to keep. How the victims stack up high while gilded rod is praised. The stench of sin and lies upheld, men of reproach upraised. Almighty God, with holy fire, purify your bride. Break the knees of wicked men drunk upon their pride. Keep the lambs all tossed aside, safe upon your chest. Give them healing, give them hope, give them peace and rest. As we end, if you have a story like Colleen or Megan's in the PCA, OPC, Reformed Church in general, or the CREC, please know you're not alone. Know we care about you, and many others do as well. Reach out to us and find out how to do so in our show notes, but do so safely, especially if you're still in an environment like the movements we're profiling. There really is help out there for you, and we'll help you find it. Next week, we've got a special on the CREC. Maybe you've heard them in the news lately. Wait till you hear this. See you then. Sons of Patriarchy is brought to you by the administrators of Examining Doug Wilson in Moscow in partnership with Peter Bell. It's written, produced, and edited by Peter Bell. Original music, sound design, and mixing by Aaron Feeney. This series wouldn't be possible without the dozens of abuse survivors whose bravery and vulnerability make it what it is. Every episode was sent to them before being published, and their feedback, edits, encouragement, and eventual approval make this what it is. May your voices be heard far and wide. Thank you.